My name is Anthony Kneski. I'm the Parks Event Volunteer Coordinator for Scenic Hudson, and behind me is Kate Grill, who is Scenic Hudson's Education and Outreach Coordinator, and her assistant, who's an SCA AmeriCorps intern, is Kristen Sullivan. So a bunch of us here today. Raise your hand if you've never been in the building before. All right. Raise your hand if you've never been to Long Dock Park before.
Really?
Raise your hand if you've traveled more than 30 miles.
Tonight?
Yeah.
Of course, boy.
Okay, cool. So it's all right. So those of you that haven't been to Long Dock, unless you have, this is a beautiful spot. I recommend coming back in the summertime. There's great hiking here, birding. The wetlands are beautiful. We have great volunteer corps that help keep the park in great shape. We have actually Janine and Jean, some great volunteers, and Dave. Where are you? Oh, right there. So thanks to these guys that help keep the park great. If anybody's interested in volunteering, talk to me at the end of this. But welcome. It's about 6 o'clock now, so I'll let Tom get started. I'd like to welcome Tom Blake, who's done a bunch of lectures for us before. He's done programs for us out in the river, lots of scening with kids, and just a great guy, great speaker. Excited to hear him. Thank you, Tom.
Thanks, Anthony. Yeah. Yeah, welcome. If you haven't never been to, some of you said you have never been to Long Dock Park before. It's one of those places on the river, like there are many places. It's a Four Seasons park. You come here in the wintertime and walk on the ice. You can walk out on the river on the ice and feel relatively safe. The ice is safe. You can go seining, you can go swimming, you can go fishing, crabbing. I grew up in Beacon. I was born in Beacon. I grew up in Beacon. I remember when this area here was a hazardous waste site. I mean, there were oil docks and just horrible things going on here along the entire Beacon waterfront. So to look at it now, my introduction to the Hudson River was right here, and it scared the hell out of me because of a lot of different things, the smell in the air and the oil on the water and the creaky docks and the whole thing. So to go from that to be transformed into what it is today, thanks to Scenic Hudson, it's just an amazing accomplishment. So it's definitely a place you're going to want to come and visit. We're talking about the lives and legends of Hudson River fish. It's kind of a provocative title, and I do that intentionally because a lot of people say, it's fish. They taste good. But the whole idea is the Hudson River, we measure the health of the Hudson River in lots of different ways. And, really the goal of all of us who live on this planet is to have clear air, clean water, and healthy land. And the river's part of that. And the river kind of is where they all come together. And so I'd like to talk to you this evening about what we have out of the Hudson River in terms of fish. We won't talk about all of the fish, but I'll talk about many of them. I'll tell you about different categories of fishes and what their roles are and how some of them got here. There are certain lives and legends of fish. They're not all, they're out in the river. They've all got a story to tell. Whenever I have students on the river and we catch fish, I tell them every fish in that net has a story to tell, and we're going to talk about them. So no matter what fish you catch, however many, however few, there's always stories that you can tell. And so we're going to do that. I'm hoping my advancer works, and it's not. For some reason, it's not working. Okay, I'm just going to have to come over here and hit this from time to time. One of the things that I do I work for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation as an educator and as a naturalist. So I do a lot of programs on the river. I also am the editor of the Hudson River Almanac. We're just ending our 22nd year now. We've got at least 9,600 people who get a copy of it every week. I don't know if any of you or some of you I know get it. It's a free email that comes in the mail. And what I think I will do, if it's okay with you guys, is to pass around a clipboard. If you don't get it and you think you might want to get it, just give me your email address and your name, and we'll make sure that you do get it. The Hudson River Almanac has been around, ever since I've been working with DEC, almost 23 years now. And what it essentially is a compilation of stories that people tell, like yourself. I have stuff from kindergartners, stories that they tell, poems they write, through PhDs who tell us these very incredible stories about the life and the life cycles out in the Hudson River. So it runs this range from very poetic to very scientific type data. And it's this blend, I think, which people kind of like. We have photographs. Every week people send me photographs. The ones that we can use, we use. And the stories we use, the adventures that you have. David Lindeman goes out and stalks the bald eagles. And he'll tell us a story about what they're up to. Or is mom and dad getting ready for a new season of breeding baby eagles? And sure enough, they are. And so the average person doesn't have time to go out and find a bald eagle nest to observe for themselves. they can live that vicariously through Dave's stories when he sends them to us. So that's kind of what the almanac's all about: flora, fauna, weather phenomenon. Floods and storms, and the lack of a winter is a weather phenomenon right now. We're certainly not having much of a winter. And also, I've always felt this to be true, that fish are the best measure of how we treat our world. We have, as a species, we tend to, if not kept in check, abuse our waterways, our lakes, ponds, streams, creeks, and so on. And so the measure in which our fish are healthy, our fish populations are healthy, really is a report card on how well we're treating the world and the river in this case. So I think that's a pretty important measuring point, how well we treat the world that we live in. Fish are like the canary in the coal mine. We've seen this for a long time now, that when certain populations of fish begin to disappear, or they begin to show up with ulcers on them, or some other phenomenon that is an indication that things are not right, you can usually trace that back to something that we've done. Certainly there are natural phenomena out there which can cause fish populations to fluctuate. There are natural phenomena that can cause fish to get sick. But oftentimes we see a massive fish kill. It's because we've done something stupid. So they're like the canary in the coal mine. Oftentimes we can get an early warning on something we're doing, and with the right regulations we have in this country, theoretically through the EPA, we can handle most of that. Now, fish are cryptically mysterious. Let me tell you what I mean by that. If we tomorrow morning were to come down here, and I was going to take you out and look for bald eagles, we go look for bald eagles, you'd probably find one in the big oak tree right here. There's an immature hangs out here. In the springtime, we look for butterflies. We look for butterfly. We could go look for reptiles, amphibians, birds, anything like that. We can go out, we can find them, fox and coyotes, and we can look in the woods and maybe find them, maybe we wouldn't. But fish are different. When I take students, and I do frequently, down to the beach here at Long Dock, and I have a group of class of 4th graders, and I look out on the river and I say, look up as far as you can, or look down as far as you can, look up as far as you can. And between those two views, I'm going to tell you there are at least 1 million fish out there in the Hudson River. They can't see them. They have to take my word for it. Right? They're there, but they're hidden. You cannot see them because they're in the water. So a lot of the programs that we do on the Hudson River involve putting nets in the water to catch some of those fish, put them into aquaria, show students, and then put them back in the river again, to sort of verify the claims we've made of a very rich Hudson River. This is most often easily shown in summer and fall when there's a lot of baby fish out there. It's not uncommon when I have kids down here in the fall time, August, September, October, we'll pull a net on the beach over here, and one pull of my 80-foot net, we'll catch 1,000 fish. 1,000 fish. So many that we almost can't pull the net up on the beach. And in that case, what we'll do is we'll leave the net in the water and let the students just kind of look at them and swimming around and kind of get a feel for what's there, then release them back in the water so we don't kill them. So it's this cryptic mysteriousness of these fish that are so enticing for students. So children are fascinated by fish, and it's probably because they don't see them that often. A lot of children have a goldfish or fish in a tank in their house and things like that. Almost all the time, they're from some faraway place. They're from South America or Africa, or a goldfish that was bred locally, but certainly not a native species. But children are fascinated by the idea of fish. And as far as the Hudson River is concerned, in fact, everywhere on Earth, people love big fish. Here's a bunch of, I think there were 6th graders we had up at Norrie Point last year, and we're catching these big carp. Everybody was fascinated by them, and those are the things that make people's eyes go wide and, wow, this is tremendous. Maybe not so much for carp because it's not a native fish, but it's still a big fish. But it's the little fish that tell us the most. We've known this for a long time. When you study the fish populations of the Hudson River, it's the baby fish that really count. When you pull a net in the river and all you're catching are big fish, continually, you have to ask your question, that's fine, but when these fish die, when's the next year class coming up? The best thing, and this is what we see in the Hudson River, which makes us feel really assured about our future, we will pull a net here in the summer and the fall, and we will get this year's fish, last year's fish, the year before, various sizes of fish, all these year classes wonderfully represented, and it lets us know that the system is working properly and is producing baby fish every year. The Hudson River has long been a mecca for sport fishermen to come here and catch fish, and they often complain, particularly to me, about they catching all these little baby striped bass. Well, they're here looking for the ones that can hang on a wall, or at least tell people they caught a big fish. And I tell them, you know, this is a nursery area for fish. Yeah, there are big fish here, not all the time, but there's some big fish here. We have some 50, 60-pound striped bass. But this river is a nursery area for baby fish. There's a lot of spawning going on here, and it provides a nursery area for baby fish until they get to a size where they can kind of fend for themselves. As a result, it's a very productive estuary, and it produces a lot of baby fish. We see the importance in that. Now, I love fish, but I have to admit there was a time before fish. Here in the Hudson River, there was a time before fish. And that was 21,000 years ago. Right here at Long Dock, we would have had 10,000 feet of ice over our heads. 10,000 feet of ice over our heads. It was the peak of the last ice age that we had, and nobody was home. There were some birds here. There probably were the kinds of birds there then that now we see up in the Arctic, where seabirds will often go to nest right on the ice for a lack of predators. Other than Arctic fox, there's not a lot of predators in the far North Arctic area around Hudson Bay and all. And that's kind of like it was here. There wasn't a whole lot going on. We didn't have any fish. As far as we know, there were no fish here 21,000 years ago. And glacial ice covered almost all of New York State. A lot of ice. It eventually melted, and part of the glacial ice melt here in the Hudson Valley and the Mohawk River Valley, it formed these big glacial lakes. Glacial Lake Iroquois was in the Mohawk River Valley. That was the forerunner to Lake Ontario. From here north was what we call Glacial Lake Albany. It went on up around Lake Champlain area. And from somewhere in this area south was Glacial Lake Hudson. These huge, big, deep, cold water glacial lakes. They were formed because when the glaciers melted, the leading edge of the glacier had carried the most stuff in its belly as it swept across the land. And when it melted, it left dams of something called glacial moraine across the lower part of the Hudson Valley at that time. And so it was a dam. So these lakes were building up behind it. Eventually, those dams would break free, and the water was able to leave and go out into the ocean. But for a while, we had these huge, deep glacial lakes. Most studies have shown, most ichthyologists believe that the first fish probably arrived here at that time. And by about 15,000 years ago, the ice was pretty much gone out of the northeast. One thing you'll notice in a lot of these kinds of presentations, whether it's about fish, particularly about anthropology, archaeology, you'll see this tilde here, the about sign. I've changed this date so many times for this presentation. In fact, the last time I gave it, I had 13,000. Then I read some literature where it says, nah, the ice might have hung around. It might not have hung around quite as long. So by 15,000 years ago, the ice was gone, and so fish were able to make their way into the Hudson Valley. And the Hudson River watershed was born. This is the Hudson River watershed. You can see it's a lot of New York State for sure, the Mohawk River Valley, a little bit of Vermont, a little Massachusetts, a little bit of Connecticut down in here, and some of northern New Jersey's over here as well. So this is a pretty large watershed. This watershed geologically was created by this last ice age. It's the glacier went from northeast to southwest, and it kind of created this trough. And when the glacial meltwaters melted, the ice melted, it carved out the Hudson Valley that we see today. And about 12,500 years ago was the birth of what we call the estuary. The Hudson River, kind of as it is today. Now, a true estuary has tides, and we think that 12,500 years ago, that probably the water was going one way out to the ocean. It probably wasn't coming back quite yet. And the reason for that was that 21,000 years ago, when we had all that ice, a lot of the ocean waters were lowered by as much as 250 to 400 feet. So when the Hudson became an estuary and it was broken open to the sea, the ocean was still 100 miles offshore. So the Hudson ran out to this 100 miles across the continental shelf into what's the ocean, but there was not enough strength or anything to get the tides back in here. So it may not have been until 9,000 or 10,000 years ago that tides began to come into the lower Hudson Valley. It didn't mean fish couldn't go. As long as we were open to the sea, fish were able to come into the Hudson Valley. Now, our Hudson River fish fauna today, as best as we know it, is 224 species. I have a checklist of all these 224, by the way, and here's what it looks like right here, front and back. And I use this when I do programs with students because they're able to take this, and whatever fish we catch on a particular day, they can go and they can check off the fish they saw. They can add notes. And what it gives them is an idea of the fish they caught in relationship to all the other fish that are in the river. This is what we call a taxonomic order, from the most primitive species, the oldest that have been around, to more recent species out here at 224. There are copies of this in the desk out front. So if you have to leave early, you can grab one of them on the way out. If not, you can just grab one of those on the way out. Now you might notice I have 171 native fish in the Hudson. When we study fish in the Hudson River, we do deal with this idea of what's native, what's not native. In fact, in the Hudson Valley, on many fronts, we deal with this. We deal with invasive species of all kinds. Plants, in particular, are a problem. Invasive species. In the Hudson with fish, we just do native and non-native. We have some fish that have been invasive that have caused us troubles, but it's more what's native and what's not native. Most of the fish that are in the Hudson River that are not native have learned to get along with other fish for the most part. And we'll talk about those. What do we mean by native, though? We use a benchmark for that. We ask the question, was the fish here in 1609? If it was here in 1609, then it's a native species. If it wasn't, that means afterwards it was brought here. Because one thing the Europeans did when they came here, they began tinkering with everything. Bringing in fish, bringing in birds, bringing in plants, because they couldn't believe that this Hudson Valley, this country, this hemisphere could possibly have the natural wonders that Europe had. And so they had to bring things over here to make better the natural history here. In their defense, they didn't really know what they were doing. They didn't realize they were creating up adversarial relationships between native fauna and non-native fauna. So we asked that question, were they here in 1609? 76% of our species were here, others were not. The categories of fishes in the Hudson, and these are broad categories. Fish move back and forth between the other. We have freshwater fish, we have saltwater fish, and then we have fish that can live in either place. And we have a lot of fish like that can either live in the river here where it's fresh, or they can live out off Coney Island. The trick with most of those fish is, if you took a fish here and stuck it in the ocean at Coney Island, it would die. Conversely, Coney Island to here, it would die. It's the transition between here and there that allows it to go to both places. When a fish is here off a beacon, relatively fresh water, it is excreting fresh water out of its system and it's retaining salt. Because salt is something that doesn't have very much of. When they're out in the ocean, it's just the opposite. They're getting rid of all the salt out of their system and they're retaining fresh water for a balance. As they move from one to the other, the physiological change is they undergo this change from being able to retain or excrete salt or fresh water. So if they move from one system to the other, the blend of the Hudson River goes from very fresh to very salt. It allows them to make that change. That's why when fish come up the river, and we know this from tagging studies, sonic tagging studies, that fish just don't come in the harbor and swim up the Hudson River. They do an S-curve as they come up the Hudson River, looking for saltier, fresher, saltier, saltier, fresher, fresher. And they'll even back down at a tide once in a while if they run into something that's a little more than they can handle. So fish take their time for the most part, moving up the river and then moving back out of the river again. So it's this wonderful blend of this river of salt and fresh water that is very magical. And it's part of what allows us to have as many fish as we have. Now, 224 fish, I've often been asked, what does that number mean? It means 224 fish. If you look at the east coast of North America, where we are, 224 fish is about what we ought to have. Not that there's some fish out there we don't know and we haven't discovered. The real number might be somewhere around 250. We just haven't found the rest of them yet. But if you move north on the coast, up into the Canadian Maritimes, up in that area, colder the water, the fewer the species. If we move south into Delaware Bay, Chesapeake Bay, the Carolinas, warmer the water, greater number of species. Warmer water can support a more diverse number of populations of fish. Colder water cuts down on its ability to support populations of fish. Fish do better with warmer water than colder water. There's more warm water fish than cold water fish, to put it that way. So where we are at 221 is about right. And now we talk about things like climate change. What's going to happen? Well, we're seeing in the Hudson, we'll get to that in a few minutes. Some of our fish are finding it to be too warm in the Hudson River right now. And they're starting to, little by little, not showing up anymore. They're up in New England, they're staying up there. And some fish we normally would think of as in southern waters are finding themselves comfortable here in the Hudson River. So these are some of the subtle very, very, very subtle changes that we think are examples of climate change. Now, the first fishes that came here, think back to those glacial lakes. Very cold water, not a whole lot of food in that water, but enough. Some of the very first fish, we call them periglacial fish, fish that came after the glaciers. And one of those happened to be northern pike. You don't necessarily think of northern pike as a fish like that, but they're very much of a cold water fish. They can live in warm water too, but they really like cold water. Some of the first fish. Here's a couple others: the brook trout and the lake trout. The brook trout is the official fish of New York State. It's the state fish. These fish have been here right from the very beginning. They did very well in very cold water. Today, brook trout and lake trout are found in deep cold waters or in the Adirondack trout streams, places like that. You won't find them. I never find a lake trout in the Hudson. They may be there, but I never find them. And the brook trout are pretty much limited to some of the tributaries where it's fairly cold, fairly fast-moving cold water. Our native freshwater fishes, and I'm going to touch on a few of them. I can't get into them all because there's just too many of them. But I'll give you an example of some of our favorites. The spot-tailed shiner is one of those. Notice the Latin name of the spot-tailed shiner, Naturalist Hudsonius. Every living thing on Earth has a scientific name. We're Homo sapiens sapiens. Okay? This fish is Naturalist Hudsonius. Somebody sat down and took a spot-tailed shiner and they put it in a fish tank and they sat down and they in much detail, wrote down everything about that fish they could think of. The number of scales in the lateral line, and the number of fins, where the fins were placed, and how many teeth it had or didn't have, the spot on the tail, all these kinds of things. And when they got done, they had a description of a unique fish, and that became basis for a species. And this one here was the Naturalist Hudsonius. The place it was described was right here in the Hudson Valley. So it's sort of like our fish. It's the only fish that we know of that was described right here from the Hudson River. And that's a nice story too, but the real story here is who described this was DeWitt Clinton. Between his two times as governor of New York State, he had time in between to go around describing fish. We don't have politicians who can do that today. They don't have the time, and I would have to say they don't have the wherewithal to do it either. But those are the good old days. You have people like Thomas Jefferson, and DeWitt Clinton, who described a species of fish. We catch a lot of these here at Long Dock almost any year. In fact, on Christmas Eve this year, it was so warm. My grandson and I went out and we went seining. We caught a whole bunch of these on Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve, we were pulling a net in the river. There's no reason why the fish even been there, but they were certainly there. And some of the more beautiful fish we had, the red-breast sunfish. I've often thought that people spend a lot of money to fill their aquaria with fish from South America and Africa and places like that, or even tropical fish from this country, who are beautiful. And we have beautiful fish in the Hudson River as well, in their own way, and sometimes they're absolutely colorfully beautiful too. The red-breast sunfish happens to be one of those. And the nice thing about some of the fish we have in the Hudson, and I did mention they're cryptically mysterious. You don't know they're out there. There are times when you can go and see fish. For example, in Fishkill Creek, just give you an example, any tributary, pick any one, but I'm picking Fishkill Creek because it's right here in Beacon. In the springtime, if the water's fairly clear, you can walk along the bank and you can pick out certain kinds of fish. And if you learn, we call the field marks, you can say that's a pumpkin seed sunfish, that's a red-breast sunfish, that's a herring, just by the way it swims, by its shape, by its color, by spots and all that. The red-breast sunfish happens to be one of those. You can be walking along, and you'll see some very diagnostic colors on it. I liken this to if we were out birding tomorrow, and we're out here on Long Dock, and a red bird flew over you. That's a cardinal. A bluebird flies over. It was a big bluebird. It'd be a blue jay. If it was a small bluebird, it might be a bluebird. And an eagle, the white head and the white tail. These are field marks. These are things that we don't have to take out a book and say, let's see, what is this we're looking at? You know because you have taken those field marks and put it in your head. If you're out here in May, you'll see Baltimore Orioles, orange and black, all over the place. Those are field marks. You don't have to look them up. You pretty much know them if you are after birds. Fish can be that way too. Not quite as easy, but you can do it too. The pumpkin seed sunfish. Here's another picture of the pumpkin seed sunfish. They have this little red tab on their opercle, and when they're swimming in the water, you can see that little red tab if the water's clear. Fishkill Creek in the springtime, if we haven't had a lot of rain, you can do it there too. Here's a male. This is right here, by the way, in the dock over here. Here's a a pumpkin seed in breeding colors. This was in last March, I think it was. My grandson and I were fishing it. We caught this beautiful pumpkin seed sunfish. Beautiful turquoise piping on its head and all. Gorgeous little fish. Gorgeous big fish, in fact. A mentor of mine, Dr. C. Levette Smith, former curator emeritus of the American Museum of Natural History, wrote a wonderful book called Fish Watching, where he talks about what I've just been talking about, how you can walk along streams and lakes, and you can recognize fish by things you've learned, field marks you've come to be familiar with. What I do here, I've done this here at Long Dock, I've gone snorkeling off the beach over here. And while visibility in the Hudson River at best is no more than about 4 or 5 feet, oftentimes 4 or 5 feet is enough if you're quiet to see schools of herring, schools of little baby striped bass, and other fish swimming around. You can actually get into their world and see them as they're moving around naturally. When we catch them in the net and put them in a tank, they're scared. They're all over the place. Yeah, they're alive. You're not going to kill them. They're not happy though. But you can go snorkeling and you can see them in their natural surroundings, and it's another way to be able to see fish. Here's a couple species. I'm just going to run through some species. Yellow perch is a native fish. The N means native. The bluegill sunfish, one of our most popular fish for people to catch, especially children, on rod and reel with almost any kind of bait. They're not native here. They were imported, or they were brought from the Midwest here. They're not a native. They were not. Henry Hudson did not dine on bluegill sunfish. Put it that way. The white sucker is a native fish, and one thing you'll notice through a few slides that I have here is that our bald eagles that live in the Hudson Valley, they dine well. I can think of probably 15 or 20 different kinds of fish in the Hudson River, from eels to sturgeon to striped bass to white suckers. Our bald eagles eat very well. And in another month, the mama will be on eggs. All the mamas in the Hudson Valley. We got 3 dozen eagle nests in the Hudson Valley right now. 3 dozen mamas will be on their eggs. And by the 1st of April, there'll be mouths to feed in those nests. And dad and mom will be out catching fish like this, and eels and baby squirrels and turtles, and you name it, they bring to the nest for food. But certainly all the fish we have in the river are certainly a bounty for the eagles. It's one of the reasons the eagles have recovered so well in the Hudson Valley is because we've taken such good care of our fish. Here's a baby white sucker, which we caught right over here on the beach. Many of you, I don't know how many of you remember this. None of you are old enough, I'm sure. But back in the early part of the 20th century, up to about World War II, we had some mom and pop cottage industries in the Hudson Valley. People used to catch herring and pickle them and sell them. They used to catch white suckers and pickle them and sell them, along with shad and striped bass and other fish as well. But suckers and herring used to be springtime industries where people would go into the tributaries and they would catch these fish and they would clean them and pickle them and sell them to their friends. Everybody knew who in the neighborhood was selling this stuff, and they make very well on it. So white suckers are a very tasty fish, a little bit bony, but if you pickle them, the bones go away. Killifish. One of the things I talk to students about constantly, remember I mentioned every fish has a story to tell, and these guys have a story to tell. I often begin talking about these fish with their killifish, beginning with fish is fish. Kill is an old Dutch word. It's not in the current Dutch vocabulary, but the old Dutch, Henry Hudson's Dutch, was a word called kill, and it meant streams. So these were fish of the streams. I often have labeled this fish as one of the most important fish in the Hudson River. They're little, they're no bigger than your index finger, but they're very important. And the reason for that is what they eat. They eat mosquito larvae. Every day, many times they're weight in mosquito larvae. And I've often said to students, if you could snap your fingers and all the killifish went away, you probably couldn't sit outside at night. These are used as a biological control by environmental groups like DEC and the New York City DEP to control outbreaks of mosquito-borne disease, like West Nile virus, for example, in New York City. They've used killifish as a way, putting them in ponds, small bodies of water. Rather than spraying a whole neighborhood with who knows what, they'll put killifish, and it seems to be an effective biocontrol. So killifish are very, very important. Their importance in the river cannot be understated. Blue band mud. This is a male of the banded killifish. Its colloquial name is the blue-banded mud minnow. This picture does not do us justice. When we catch these in June, usually in June, and I put them in a little fish tank and I show students out on the beach, here's a banded killifish, beautiful lavender bars and stripes, beautiful, beautiful colors. And it gives me an opportunity to talk to them about something we call sexual dimorphism. Now you start using the word sexual dimorphism to sixth graders, and the boys all start giggling, the girls start going like this, But it's exactly true. It's why a lot of female birds are drab color. They don't want to stick out. They're guarding the. Women do all the heavy lifting in nature for the most part. So women have to take care of the nest. Women guard the nest with most fish as well. Meanwhile, the males are out there showing off. Right? They're showing off who they are. So the males have these. This isn't in every case, but in many cases, males have the beautiful, beautiful colors. The pumpkin seed, the red-breast sunfish, all those beautiful colors and all. Those are males. The females are quite drab-looking. So, a teaching point. Tell them about why we do that. Now, humans don't really do that. With us, it's the opposite, right? It's the women that are beautiful. But in nature, with fish, it's the other way around. Men are very, very showy. Males, you say. Now, a little further downriver, we never get them here. We have another killifish called a striped killifish. Beautiful. Beautiful. The male has vertical bars and the females have horizontal bars. Beautiful fish. These are invaluable in places like the New Hackensack Meadowlands and coastal marshes. There are billions of them in there, millions anyway, and they're a very important part of that system. Temperate marine species. Within this 224 fish, one of the categories are these temperate marine fishes. Fishes that live in the ocean and also feel comfortable coming into the Hudson River. One of them have this guy right here called the moss bunker or the Atlantic menhaden. They come in the Hudson River in late spring. They actually spawn sometimes in the lower part of the Hudson River, and they're in here by the tens of millions. And they're reproducing in such tremendous numbers to ensure that they'll have a stable population because they're fed on by everything. They're the Snickers bars of the lower Hudson River. Everybody wants to eat these. They taste horrible. I've smoked them. I've tried to eat them. They taste horrible. But to a bluefish or a striped bass, they're wonderful. To tell you what happens with this fish, most of the time, this time of the year in February, our Atlantic menhaden that will be in the Hudson River, this area, New York Harbor, in the summer and fall, are now down off the Carolinas, except we have not had a winter. And these fish are still in Long Island Sound. The water's not nearly as cold as it was this time last year. They know it's not spring, summer, or fall. They know it's winter, but they can tell by the angle of the sun and all. But the water temperature tells them, linger, stay around, so they are. So climate change can have these, that's short term, so it may not be climate change, but those are the kind of things long term that may have an issue. Here's one called a black drum. This is a fish that for years I often wonder why it wasn't on our list. These are huge fish. They can get to over 100 pounds. A black drum, huge, big fish. They gobble 5 oysters at a time when they're on oyster bars. Big brutes of fish, and they're in New Jersey, they're in Delaware Bay, they're in Chesapeake Bay, they're out in the ocean, and I just never had them in the Hudson. And I was wondering why. Why is that? And a lot of times when we don't have a fish on our list, it means no one has had the opportunity to actually catch one and then record it and let us know about it. They may have caught it and put it back and not know what it was. Until a couple years ago, this dead one washed up on the shore down at Piermont Pier, River Mile 25, on the left there. This dead big drum must have weighed in life 70 pounds, 65 pounds or so. And I looked at that and I said, the first drum in this river that I would put on my list, I would expect it to be a baby drum, not a dead big old drum. So my suspicions were that somebody was playing a hoax on us. As a little sidebar to this, I have to tell you that I'm the keeper of the fish list. And as a result, through time, there have been times when people have played hoaxes, not necessarily on me, but on the fisheries people, the community in general. We've had people take hammerhead sharks that they caught out in the ocean, put them in their truck them up to Kingston, and leave them on the beach. Yeah. We've had hammerhead sharks. Hammerhead sharks are a favorite. Hammerhead sharks at Cornwall across the river. We had other species of fish left at various places. Blue sharks, which are way off there, offshore fishes, right? Blue sharks at various places in the Hudson Valley. luckily, we have the technology to be able to test these fish, and what you can do is you look at with a tissue sample, you can discover if when they died they were in salt water or not, and every time they've been in salt water. But so when I looked at this, I said, maybe somebody caught this fish in Delaware Bay or Chesapeake Bay and brought it up here and dumped it on the beach. Show everybody in the neighborhood this big fish he caught, and then who's going to eat it, right? Put it on the beach. And then the next year, we were having a program in Piermont, and lo and behold, a baby shows up. On the right there, it's a baby black drum. So now I put it on the list anyhow because I said, God, great opportunity to get this fish on there. But then when the baby showed up, that was conclusive proof that, yeah, they're here. Why they're here now, like all of a sudden, the big dead drum there is probably 15 years old. I mean, where have they been? And in subsequent years, the last couple of years, we've been catching little baby drums. So we're glad to have the drum on the list. I'm so relieved that this wasn't somebody's idea of a hoax. These are beautiful, beautiful fish. They have a companion fish called a red drum or a channel bass. We still haven't got one of those yet. There's no reason why they're not here either, but sooner or later maybe. The spot, Norfolk spot. This is a little fish. Member of a family called drum, the drum family. Croakers are in that. The weak fish are in that. They're called drums because they've got a specialized swim bladder. And when I think it's called osmoregulation, when they regulate where they are in the water column, they can release air out of that bladder, or they can get air into their bladder to kind of regulate where they are. And when they do that, that swim bladder vibrates. It makes kind of a drumming sound. If you were to take this guy or a croaker or one of those fish and put it up to your ear, it would croak at you. You would actually hear a little drumming inside. So we call them the drums. This is an interesting fish. It's typical of some ocean fish that we find in the Hudson is that they're not here for 5 years and then they're everywhere for a year and a half or 2 years. Then you don't see them for 10 years and then they're all over the place. The cycles of abundance and scarcity in nature are evident all of the time with all fishes, with all life for that matter, except for us. But with some fishes, it's even more exasperating. You'll see great valleys, peaks and valleys between abundance and scarcity. This happens to be one of them here. The colloquial name for this, and if you've been around for a long time and you're on the river a lot, you would have heard the name Lafayette. It's a colloquial name given to this fish called the spot. The Lafayette was its name forever. From the 18th century up until World War II, nobody knew him as the spot. They knew him as the Lafayette. The Marquis de Lafayette, who was one of the big heroes of the American Revolution, getting France involved, becoming a general, winning battles. Lafayette did a lot for us in our battle for independence from Great Britain. In 1824, Lafayette, after having been away for a long time, decided he would come back to the United States and kind of make a tour through some major cities. And they gave him a ticker tape parade in Manhattan. And the year he was here, 1824, after these fish having been nowhere, suddenly they were everywhere. Everybody was catching them in bucketfuls. And so they named the fish in honor of the Marquis de Lafayette. So they were known as the Lafayette for a long time. Kind of a nice name. This past year, they were everywhere. We even caught a couple up here, which is really kind of surprising because these are a fish that likes a little salt in the water. And there was very little salt out here, but apparently enough. They didn't need a lot. So that's another one of these little saltwater fish, little small fish. Doesn't get bigger than 9 or 10 inches long, something like that. Then a couple of the brutes we have. This guy is a bluefish. We do not see adult bluefish in the Hudson River north of probably Peekskill. They do like a lot of salt in the water. They do need a lot of food, and they just are not found very far up the river. But we get the baby bluefish all the way up, sometimes almost to Poughkeepsie. Little baby bluefish called snapper blues. They're known for their voracity when they're eating. They have very strong jaws, as evidenced by their name snapper. As they get bigger, they become cocktail tailor, then they become chopper blues, then become slammer blues, and then gorilla and alligator. The bigger they get, an alligator blue might be over 20 pounds. The kind of fish that when you hook it and bring it in, you don't reach in your mouth to get the hook out because they'll be calling you lefty after that, right? Bluefish, kind of a sporadic fish. In recent times, they've been very common. Their population has been very common. I do remember 20, 30 years ago when there was a time when bluefish, we used to know where they went. There weren't very many around at all. So all these fish have cycles. Most of those cycles are based upon things like the availability of prey, water temperature, things like that, as opposed to anything we're doing. But sometimes it affects our effect too. Sharks. Sharks. When I'm talking to students, it always comes down to that. They'll listen about killifish and spot-tailed shiners and all that, and then they pause. And when I pause, they say, what about sharks? And I tell them sharks are an interesting topic because we are open to the ocean. When you're here at Long Dock Park, you are about 60 miles from the tip of Manhattan, add another 11 miles out to the Verrazano. So you're roughly 70, 71 miles to essentially open ocean, the lower bay of New York Harbor, all open to the ocean. And sharks can swim. And sharks, different species, have had a reputation of swimming up rivers like the Hudson and grabbing people off the beach and all kinds of things like that. That has happened. Not in recent times. But in New Jersey, they had a problem back 100 years ago when people in tributaries in northern New Jersey were taken over by sharks, were eaten by sharks, killed by sharks. So it could happen. So I tell them, when you go in the water here, I wouldn't worry about it because it's probably not going to happen, but I would not be shocked beyond belief if I counted heads at the end of the day and somebody wasn't here. It could happen. But the truth of the matter is we just don't have any records of any big, we call requiem sharks in the Hudson. The only record we have is this one right here from 1894. It's a bull shark that was left on the beach in Peekskill. Now, this is 1894. Nobody took a photograph of it. It was simply a written record that was in a newspaper. For some reason, we've left this on our list. My idea was, 1894, bringing a huge fish like this in from the ocean would have had it done in a cart or something, or maybe in a truck. I don't know, but probably a cart. People would have seen it. They would have known what was going on. Kind of hard to do that, not so much as it would be today. So I wonder about this, whether or not this was actually a shark that came up the river, found the water was too fresh, couldn't really deal. Although bull sharks, they do all right in fairly fresh water. So we don't know. We've kept it on there just because it's nice to have a shark on there. We have other sharks, though. I tell them the sharks you'll see in the Hudson are we call dogfish sharks. Smooth dogfish and spiny dogfish. You're still not going to find them up here for a couple of reasons. Most sharks navigate the water through sonic transmissions and receiving information back. They will swim through the water. They're very poor eyesight. Almost all sharks have this, very poor eyesight. They'll send out sonic waves, like sonar almost, and the response they get tells them, where food might be. And so they find very difficult in a river like the Hudson, it's an estuary, where you've got a lot of turbidity, a lot of suspended sediments. It's very hard to get back any kind of positive reaction that you can trust. So sharks tend to stay out where the water is clearer so they get better reception. So you're probably not going to find them up here. These two species of sharks we do see in the Hudson River from about Yonkers south to the ocean. They like shellfish, although the spiny dogfish eats a lot of fish. The smooth dogfish eats a lot of... when we had more oysters in the Hudson, I'm sure there were more smooth dogfish in the Hudson as well. They have very flat pavement-like teeth. So they're not looking to bite your foot off, but they're looking to crunch on shellfish and things like that. But we have sharks, and I happen to love these sharks. I think they're great. Here is a smooth dogfish that we caught in a net. Unfortunately, this female had got caught in the net, and before we could get her out, she actually drowned. Sharks are one of these, especially dogfish. They kind of have to be moving through the water or else they'll drown. If they're not moving water across their gills, getting oxygen, they suffocate. And this particular shark, unfortunately, got caught in a net, a research net, and before we could get it out, she actually drowned. So I took it immediately. I recognized it was a nice teaching specimen. It was pretty good size, about as big as they get. And she was very fat. And I said, well, no, she was a female. I can tell you she was a female. Very fat. I said either she's got pups, babies, or she's been eating a lot of fish. In either case, the next day in Westchester County, might have been Croton Point, I had a program with some fourth graders, I think 3 fourth grade classes. I said, I'll bring that shark there, and I will perform a cesarean, and I'll find out what's in there. If it's simply fish they've been eating, it'll be a really gross but very educational opportunity for them to see what this shark's been eating. All right, so I did. I took them there, and I told the teachers, I said, brace yourself. The kids are not going to mind this, but you might faint. So I performed a cesarean, and sure enough, there were pups inside. Yeah. And it turned out to be a wonderful program because as I looked inside, I said, oh, we got babies in here. And as I pulled them out, I said, it's a boy, and all the boys would cheer, and the girls would go, and it's a girl, and the girls would cheer. When we were all done, there were 10, and thank God there were 5 boys and 5 girls. So everything went over well. But yeah, and it was a sad, but she died. There's a lot of dogfish out there. She died, but in dying, she provided a moment of teaching for a lot, 30, maybe as many as 55 to 60 students plus the teachers had a moment that they probably will remember, me reaching into the gut of this big shark and pulling out babies and claiming boy or girl. It had a lasting effect, I'm sure, on most of these students. So we have sharks. We have pipefish, and we have seahorses in the Hudson. Not a lot. We have a lot of pipefish and some seahorses. I see maybe 1 seahorse a year. Another fish that likes salt water more than fresh. You're not going to see too many up here. What these 2 fish share in common, you can't see it on the pipefish, but on the seahorse, it's right here. They have a brood pouch, and they're the only, as far as I know, they're the only form of life, fish or mammal, where the males give birth. The female will have the eggs. The male will fertilize the eggs. And then females go over and they tell the male, in their own little way, open your pouch, and he opens his brood pouch, and she deposits the fertilized eggs into his pouch, and then she says bye, and she leaves. He then, for the entire period of those eggs, which could be a week or 2 weeks even, he swims around getting fatter and fatter and fatter as these develop into tiny, the head of a pencil size, baby seahorses or pipefish. And then when the time comes, he actually gives birth. And one time I was fortunate enough to be snorkeling at Croton Point Park in a whole field of Valson area when there was a pipefish there, 2 pipefish actually, and I watched a male with his tail. They had these prehensile tails which they wrap around vegetation to hold them in place. And he was there leaning into the current, and he gave birth, and the pouch opened and out spewed, I'm guessing, hundreds of these tiny, minute baby seahorses. And the look on his face, if you've ever gone through labor, you know that look. He was going through labor, and when and they all spewed out, and when it was all done, he went, I think he seemed like he did that. So a unique story about these fish is it's the males who give birth, and it's the only occasion I can think of where that actually happens in nature. Then there's a fish, has a story too. This is called the oyster toadfish. I will tell you the oyster toadfish, isn't he handsome? Colloquial name for this, by the way, and I mean no disrespect. The people on the river who deal with these fish call them the mother-in-law fish. It is a saltwater fish. It lives in salt water. As far as we know, it can't live in the Hudson River north of about Croton-on-Hudson, maybe Peekskill at the most, maybe, and that's only if the water's real salty. This fish was taken at Norrie Point, River Mile 85, way upriver, total freshwater. It's the kind of occurrence where you sit down and say, do we have to rewrite the literature on this fish? Or was this a special occasion, or what? We don't really know. But here's a fish that was caught at Norrie Point, an adult, not even a baby, that was, I'm guessing, 40 to 50 miles north of where it ever should have been found. So the other thing about the Hudson I tell students all the time, besides being open to the sea, which means you should expect the unexpected, you never know what you're going to find. When you pull a net in the river, to me, it's like a birthday party and you're opening presents. You never know what's in there. You might find something nobody has ever seen before. Just a bit of a sidebar. We just went through an episode a month ago, and it's still going on now, where we went in the upper river and we rescued a gray seal that had been marooned above the Troy Dam for 133 days. And I assisted a lot of other people to get the seal back to Long Island and put back in the ocean. And now, 50 days later, the gray seal is having a great time on the coast, joining other seals and living like a seal. But we were able to rescue it out of the river. Who would have expected a gray seal, an Arctic seal at that? Gray seals are Arctic seals, to be in the Hudson River in Saratoga County. You know, never underestimate the river's ability to be able to surprise you. Atlantic needlefish. These, in the summertime, you walk on the beach here, especially where the kayak dock is right here. And I've been here and looked out, and people have said, "Oh, look at all the little sticks floating in the water out there." They weren't sticks; they were needlefish, but they're like sticks. They float on the water. They have a lateral line. Just a bit of a technicality here. They have a lateral line that's way down in here. Normally it's in the middle of the fish. Theirs is way down here. So a needlefish can sit right up on top of the water, and that lateral line gives them that interface so they still know they're in the water, and they can look around. They feed by eyesight. And their jaws are all teeth, and they dart all over the place. They feed on baby fish. When I first started studying Hudson River fish 30 years ago or more, the literature said these are ocean fish. You'll never find them in the Hudson River north of New York Harbor. Now we find babies up in Kingston, baby needlefish. And it's not that we're doing a better job of looking than we did. The fish have changed. They have been able to adapt. We don't even know why they've been able to adapt. But most literature now will tell you these fish are really saltwater fish. But we're finding them in the Hudson River in fresh water. We have flounders. We have winter flounder, summer flounder. Most easily distinguished by which side of the head their eyes are on. This is a summer flounder right here. The eyes are on the left-hand side of the head. This is the pigmented side. The underside is white. The winter flounder, the eyes are on the right-hand side of the head. When these fish are born, they look like any other fish. They have eyes on both sides. And shortly after they're born, not too distant future after that, their head begins to rotate, their eyes begin to rotate, and if in their DNA it says to become a left-handed flounder, the eyes will rotate over their head this way. If they're a right-handed flounder, it will go this way. So within a few weeks to a month or so, they begin to lay on their side, and they move into the form of a flounder. But they begin life looking like a regular fish with two eyes, on one on each side of their head. I think of it almost like a computer program. It's going through the code. Those of you who understand the code of a program, it's like there's a program going on, and at some point an instruction comes up and says, eyes move, body move, and it's kind of neat. That's how our flounders work. Here's a typical one. I caught this on the beach right here. We don't often find flounder this far upriver because they do need salt. But we've had some summers. This might have been a summer before this summer when we had 15% seawater out here, maybe close to 20%, 15% anyhow of seawater. So there were some of these around. Here's a little baby summer flounder. It's on the left side of the head, right on the beach over here. A little baby summer flounder. Now these have to be like 17 inches to take it home and put it in your frying pan. But to see the babies tells us something. It means that the population is healthy. We have another type of flatfish called the hog choker. Another fish with a story to tell. The hog choker is a member of the sole family. It's not a true flounder. It's a member of the sole family. They're still flatfish. The story goes with hog chokers that if you go back 100 years ago, when the Hudson Valley was very rural and there was a lot of livestock, a lot of farms, farmers who had a lot of livestock needed a lot of food to feed them, to feed a lot of the livestock. And so what they would do is they'd come down the river, and either they would buy fish from people, or they would get fish themselves, load their wagon up, and take them back and feed them to their livestock. And among the fish they would get would be these fish here, called the hog chokers. They eat lots of these because there's a lot of them out there, a lot of them. And so they would go in and they would feed the fish to the livestock, and they would tell the farmhands, when you're feeding these to the pigs, you have to feed them head first. If you feed them tail first, if you were to take your finger and run it this way on a hog choker, it's smooth, very smooth. Run it this way, and it's like running your fingers over the edge of a steak knife. Serrated. You can't do it. So they would tell people, whoever was feeding the hogs, feed them head first, otherwise you'll choke the hogs. So that's the story that become called hog chokers. Great story. We tell it. There seems to be some basis for fact. It will choke a hog. It probably would choke anything else would eat it too. Tropical marine strays. These are the ones that get us excited because there are times when fish show up in the Hudson River that you put them in a little small tank and you hold them up to whoever you're talking to. It could be adults, it could be students, it could be little kids. And they look and they say, wow, what's that fish doing here? And that's some of these tropical fish that show up. And a lot of that has to do with the effects of the Gulf Stream. Offshore of the Hudson Valley, offshore of New York Harbor, there is a river of water that goes from south to north, a very warm river of water. It's one of those things that people who study climate change are very nervous about right now, because if the Arctic continues to melt, as it is, it could stunt the Gulf Stream, make it warmer, change its patterns. And the Gulf Stream is the only thing that keeps us from not being like Northern Europe and having incredible, incredible winters and freezes. The Gulf Stream moderates the the climate here and also in northern Europe. But the Gulf Stream has this ability to take eggs and larvae of fish in the Caribbean even and bring them north. And by the time the fish, eggs and larvae have become of a size when they can actually move out on their own, they swim inshore and we find them in the Hudson. A couple of those are these fish here, which you'd never expect to be in a river like the Hudson. In the mid-Atlantic, we get four-eyed butterfly fish, spot-fin butterfly fish. I've never caught these north of Yonkers, but we do catch them from time to time. We do catch these tropical fish. They're beautiful, beautiful little fish. Other ones are members of the jack family. The jack family is a family of fishes that the center of abundance on them is somewhere in Biscayne Bay, I think in Miami. They're really a southern group of fishes that we just don't ever see much up here. Among them are the crevalle jack, the permit. Many of these are prized game fish in those areas. The look down, the Atlantic moonfish, beautiful little fish that just don't kind of fit the pattern of the kinds of fish you'd expect to be in a temperate river like the Hudson. We have barracudas in the Hudson, which is kind of surprising. For a long time, we had never seen any of these, and now every once in a while, every year, we find one or two of these. Now, these are not the great barracuda, the one that scares the bejesus out of you when you go snorkeling in the Caribbean, but these are barracudas. There's a northern Scenic and the guaganche. They don't get to be much more than 10 or 15 or even 20 inches long, but they're simply barracudas that are a tropical species that are among those that make their way north, oftentimes via the Gulf Stream. Every once in a while, we have a fish added to our list that we never get a fish in hand. You have to different forms of evidence can sometimes be acceptable. Photographs that we know are recent. A person who really knows fish tells us they saw something. Sometimes incredible witnesses also. Well, this was an occasion where last year off the west side of Manhattan, some researchers were doing some sampling in the Hudson River, and a school of these fish came along. Never had been on our list before. They're a member of the jack family. They're really an offshore species. You don't often see them inshore. They're known to be fairly well offshore. But here they were, not only north of their range, but inshore of their range, a fish called the banded rudderfish. And they sent us a series of photographs of these fish swimming around. And by looking at these photos and others, it was very obvious what these were. These were banded rudderfish. We had never seen these fish before in the Hudson. So while I'm looking at that list of 224, by the time I speak to this program next year and I do something like this, it might be 230, it might be 228, it might be more. We may have occasions like this when the unexpected happens. A couple other fish, the bonefish. The bonefish are famous in Cuba. They're famous in the Caribbean. The South Florida, the Florida Keys, famous for bonefish. Every couple of years we get a baby bonefish in the Hudson River. It's clearly a fish that has come north in the Gulf Stream, grown to a point where it could swim for itself, come inshore, and here it is. The ladyfish, which is a smaller version of the tarpon. We haven't had tarpon in the river yet, but I wouldn't be surprised. Every once in a while they're found in Long Island Sound. I wouldn't be surprised to find one of them in here too. But the ladyfish, one occasion of this fish in the Hudson of all time. One occasion. In 1982, I was fishing at the Dan Skimmer power plant right up here. I was fishing for striped bass. And I hooked this fish that almost as soon as I hooked it, it jumped and was gone. And I hooked 4 or 5 more. They were gone. They're swimming around my boat. I had no idea what they were. I finally hooked one. As I lifted, it threw the hook, but it landed in the boat. And it was one of these. And they were there for 5 minutes, and then the school was gone. We've never seen them before, and we've never seen them since. One time, if that fish had fallen in the water, it still wouldn't be on our list. Tremendously acrobatic, tremendously strong. It was about 18 inches long or so. Still got the fish. The plain filefish. These are fish that are found in coral reefs. These are coral reef fishes, and we have found them on occasion in the lower Hudson as well. Fish out of place. Spanish mackerel. Not often, but every couple of years, I'd say every decade, I wouldn't even say every couple of years, every decade or so, we'll have Spanish mackerel in the lower Hudson River. Why? All of a sudden, we don't know. Population grows and they expand their range. Water temperatures get warm and they're urged to come north. They're drawn here, something like that. There's so much we don't know about why fish are here and why they're not here. Native species that are found here for the reasons that we can fully understand. These are called wrasses, and they're great feeders on mussels and shellfish. And New York Harbor is full of mussels and shellfish. And so we get the tautog, are called the blackfish. The cunner is another one. Lots of these in New York Harbor, lots of these. And they're excellent eating, I might tell you. They're really good eating fish. But they're very, very common, but they're one of the signature fishes of the lower Hudson. Now, diadromous fish, these are fish that live in the ocean, and they come into the river to spawn, and then they leave again. They have been the basis for commercial fishing in the Hudson River for a long, long time. And as an archaeologist, I've often done some research and studying and done some work on this. Of when were the first people that came to the Hudson Valley, theoretically anyway, to begin to catch fish? Commercial fishing didn't just start when people began to pay dollars and cents for fish. It began when a clan of native people would go out to the river because they made nets and they'd catch fish and they'd bring them in. And then they would go and swap those fish maybe for some white-tailed deer or some pelts or corn, or wouldn't be corn, something else that somebody else had, bartering, but still commercial fishing. You're actually giving one product for another product. And that may have happened as long ago as about 13,000 years ago. The BP means before present. So about 13,000 years ago, we think the first people came to the Hudson Valley, and they had a choice. There were still extinct elephants here at that time. There were mastodons here, maybe mammoths too, but mastodons for sure. They had a choice. They could either go fishing, or they could go hunt an elephant that was 10 feet high at the shoulder and weighed 10,000 pounds. Probably fishing won out. Even as macho as they must have been, fishing probably made more sense for their longevity. And we know that they did do a lot of fishing early on because some of the things that they've left behind. This is a harpoon that's made out of white-tailed deer bone. Here are scales or scutes from Atlantic sturgeon or sturgeon. I'm not sure if they're Atlantic or not. And these are net sinkers that were used to put on the bottom of their net when they fished. We found one right on the beach last spring, a net sinker. We were fishing, and some little guy, fourth grader, picked and said, "Is this what you're talking about?" Fourth grader. "This is what you're talking about?" "Yes, it's a net sinker right on the beach over here." So the evidence of people having fished in the Hudson Valley it's not tremendous, but there's a lot of it out there. Nothing that was organic. For example, that net is a modern net. But things like these sturgeon scutes, although they're organic, a lot of them still hang around. They're tough enough so they've lasted. These net sinkers certainly do. And this is a big knife made out of a rock called a chert that was used to butcher sturgeon. This is from the Hudson Valley up in Columbia County. No, Greene County. It was actually used to butcher these 500-pound sturgeon. We find these when we find these scales and scutes. So we know that people were actively involved with Hudson River fish many thousands of years ago. You can't date a lot of this stuff, but many thousands of years ago, people were involved with Hudson River fish. American shad has been a major source of sustenance for people in the Hudson Valley. Oh, and bald eagles love shad too. We were out in the river one day. I was catching shad, and I threw one back, and it was a big male shad, and this immature eagle come along and grabbed it. He couldn't lift it; it was too heavy, so he dragged it to a beach down in Chelsea. In fact, down by Chelsea, and he took it to a beach, and then he ate it. American shad has supported commercial fishing for thousands of years. The reason we don't have commercial fishing in the river anymore, particularly for American shad, has nothing to do with the edibility of the fish or the quality of the water, anything like that. It has to do with the numbers of fish that are left. For too long, the regulations on taking fish commercially has been too liberal. And what happened is we've taken the population down so far that the state and the federal government had to step in and say, we're going to have to put a hiatus on this, a moratorium on taking, in this case, American shad, to allow the population to recover. And so that's why we don't shad fish in the river anymore. It has nothing to do with the edibility of the fish or anything like that. It has to do with the numbers of fish that are out there. And it wasn't even so much in the Hudson River. The real depletion of the stocks was taking place out in the ocean. We had regulations in the river. There were certain days of the week you couldn't fish, certain limits on gear, all those kinds of things, certain places you couldn't fish in the Hudson River. But once you got out in the open ocean, commercial fishing operations out there could run 7 days a week, 24 hours a day, with as much gear as they wanted. They had nets a mile long. It's those operations that depleted the population so much that somebody had to step in and say, wait a minute, within 10 years there'll be no shad. So we don't have any more shad fishing. And it was only because we didn't know when to say when that now we don't have any. We probably will never have it again. Maybe not in my lifetime for sure, and I'm not so sure we will, because technology has gotten to a point where there's no guesswork in this stuff anymore. Big commercial operations, they use spotter planes, fish finders. There's no guesswork. When we shad fish in the Hudson River, we go out, we throw a net in the water. If the fish were there, we caught them. If not, go back another time. Today isn't like that. People won't put a net in the water until they get the fish on their fish finder. So with technology we have today, most fish, in fact, most wildlife was not meant to live in a world with us. It's a harsh thing to say, but it really is true. If you think about everything from black bears to white-tailed deer to fish, they're not equipped to deal with us. So we have to keep that in mind. Anyway, a couple of really good books on shad fishing if you're interested. Shad Run. This is a book written by Howard Breslin, which talks about the shad run in the Hudson River back in 1788, and it's wonderful because it talks about the American Revolution. People were shad fishing in the Hudson River, and every group that had boats out in the river, they had a spotter who would go on the highest point of land along the river, and they would look for British warships. Because I can tell you, if you're drifting in a 1,000-foot net down the Hudson River and a British man of war is coming up, you're in big trouble. You might lose your gear. You might lose your life. And so a lot of that kind of in there. It was really very interesting read. This is an old book. You probably can find it in used bookstores, maybe in the library. I don't know. This another one's a favorite one of mine too, called Shad Hall by Paul Corey. What made this nice is this book was local. It was written about Cold Spring. It was written about Haldane High School. It didn't call it Haldane High School, and it didn't call it Cold Spring. It called it Nelsonville, which is the area around Cold Spring. But you knew from reading it where it was. And it was about these two young guys in high school who, shunning aside the influences, bad influence of their classmates, decided they would go down to the river, befriend an old-time shad fisherman, and learn something about the river, learn something about themselves, and learn something about the idea of fishing. So it's really a nice story. And it's local, so it was fun to read it. You could easily pick up the different places on the Cold Spring waterfront of where this happened.
So there's a shad bush that flowers in the river.
Yes.
That coincides with the.
Yes, we have a flowery bush. It's a native bush, Amelantra it's called, the shad bush. And it used to be, before we had all the technology we have today with weather forecasters and climate forecasters and all. That particularly back when Native Americans were here, they would look for biological indicators to tell them when the time was to put their net in the water. And the blooming of a shad bush was one of those indicators. It's not for here. When I shad fished for a long time, and we didn't use the shad bush as much. We used the lilac, which blooms even earlier than that. That seemed to be a better indicator, even though it's not a native species. It still bloomed at about around April 1st. We knew it was time to put our nets in the river. Commercial fishing then. These were the days when it was believed you could put a net in the water and fish with impunity. The well was so deep you never hit the bottom of it. And so people did. They caught a lot of fish. Even in my lifetime, I saw commercial endeavors on the river with no thought towards any kind of conservation. They were catching fish that they didn't even know where it was going to go. Not good stories at all. Commercial fishing today, well, we don't have any to speak of. John Mylott on the left there, he fishes for herring in the river. He blue crabs out of Poughkeepsie as well. So he goes for blue crab and herring. That's about it. We don't have any real commercial fishing. And again, it's not because of the edibility of the fish, the herring or blue crabs. It's all because of population sizes. The herring are another species that are they're dropping and dropping, and so it's more about that, the effects of commercial fishing over the centuries, really. River herring is what people are. Well, John Mylott is still fishing for. The one in the middle is an ale white. The top and bottom one are blueback herring. They're very, very, very similar, and they migrate up the river by the millions. They still do migrate by the millions. They spawn, and come fall time, here they are spawning. You can look in the water. Now, if you're walking along Fishkill Creek, below the Tyrone Dam, and it's clear, you can in April, you can see these fish swimming in the water. They have a little dot behind the head right here. You'll see that. Just the way that they're moving in the water, you can tell what they are. They're frenetic, dipping and darting all over the place. The males are bumping up against the females. And you can tell what they are simply by their behavior of what's going on. Another one of those fish you can see. And then we come down to the river here in late summer and fall, and we catch these by the thousands, babies. Baby herring. Baby herring and shad, too, actually. Then there's striped bass. Long-time commercial fishing target in the Hudson River. But these guys, partly they're not being fished for because of contaminants, but the contaminants are not the issue anymore. The issue now is population size. So they're another one of these ones where they probably will never go back to commercial catch anymore, simply because the technology is just too much. They wouldn't stand a chance. This is a big, and plus they're such a huge sport fish part of the industry right now. People spend ungodly amounts of money every spring to come to the Hudson Valley to fish for these. They do. You know, they call their bosses up and say, "I'm sick today. I can't come in." They spend money on hotels and gasoline and boat rentals and bait and rods and reels and fishing licenses, and it's a huge industry in the Hudson right now to catch these big trophy fish. This one's about, I don't know, 55, 58 pounds, something like that. They've been bigger than this one, actually. Whoops. I didn't mean that. What was this one? Whoops. Where are we here? Let's see here. Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Yeah, eagles love striped bass too. Here's an eagle bringing a very nice sized striped bass back to a nest. It happens to be right near where I live. The Atlantic sturgeon is another species that is not fished for today, not at all for reasons of edibility or anything. It's simply, once again, their population has been so decimated by over-harvesting, and again, not in the Hudson River. This is one of those species that they're so big that when they're out in the shoal waters of New York Bay and South Shore of Long Island and northern New Jersey, the spotter planes can actually see them in the water. And they call the boats go over, put a net in the water, and they've got the fish. And you don't catch many of these fish to make it a day for you. Right? Here's the spawners. Part of the problem, I mentioned that a lot of this wildlife is not meant to live in a world with us. And they're a very good example. They are programmed by nature to spawn every 3 to 5 years, which means they're vulnerable all those other times when they're not spawning. And they don't get to an age when they can't spawn until they're in their 20s usually. So you add all those numbers together and you find out that it's difficult for a sturgeon to grow to an age where it can spawn even once, let alone a couple of times, without being caught by somebody or somehow die. So this is another case of where we had to step in, government had to step in and say, look, we have to put a halt to this. We have to let these fish recover. And they are recovering. There's more of these baby Atlantic sturgeon around. We couldn't find any of these babies at all. Now we are finding some. They're not easy to find because they hide in places that collection gears don't necessarily function very well. But we are finding them, so they are showing up. The short-nosed sturgeon, another federally endangered species. Unlike the Atlantic, which goes to the sea and comes back to spawn, the short-nosed stay right here in the river. Both these species of sturgeon have been a popular food fish in the river ever since people got here. There's evidence some of the very first Native Americans that were here fed on these. Smoked sturgeon is wonderful. It's so good. But now we can't legally have sturgeon. Caviar. Caviar was the mainstay of the sturgeon industry in the Hudson River for a long, long time. Caviar, and it got to a point where sturgeon were so common when they were common in the 40s and 50s and 60s and even to the 70s that fishermen would go out, catch a big sturgeon, take out the eggs, the caviar, and throw the rest of the fish back in the river. In the 90s, near the end of sturgeon fishing in the Hudson, what happened was the price of smoked sturgeon was $50 a pound, and caviar was $100 an ounce. And so a fisherman on the river only had to capture a few of these each year to make some money. A friend of mine in Columbia County said if he caught a dozen of these each year, 12 fish, he could buy a new pickup truck. And he did. Yeah. So, again, if you don't put some limits on things, and I know there's this big concern in this country that we overregulate everything. But the track record, and I've seen it myself with the fisheries in the Hudson, the track record is if you let people have carte blanche, they're going to take every last fish. I had one person said to me, so what if the sturgeon leave? I'll simply move to Long Island and catch something else that's down there. That was kind of the attitude of a lot of people. They said, I'm in it for me, and I don't really care. And that was not healthy. So what we ran into was a 400-year legacy of overharvesting. Here's an example of sturgeon the eggs were taken. These fish were going to be dumped in the Hudson River, and they would just go away. No, total waste. And the eggs were really the part of the fish which was the most valuable. So the rest of the fish just wasn't being used. Of course, in recent times, we discovered smoked sturgeon was very expensive. Another species is the American eel, Catadrome. These are fish that live in inshore waters most of their lives and then go back to the sea to spawn. This is a real mysterious fish. There's a lot we don't know about this guy. We think they spawn somewhere out here in the Sargasso Sea in the North Atlantic. And after they spawn, they move inshore. They actually move inshore all across North Europe, into the Mediterranean, into Africa, down into South America. We think that's where they come from. With all the technology we have today, we have yet to ever see a baby eel born. We've yet to see a baby eel that was any smaller than this little ribbon-like animal called a leptocephalus, which is already several days, if not a week old. We've never seen an eel spawn, an actual female spawning. We've never seen eels after they spawn. Do they die? Where do they go? We've never found an eel that has spawned and lived. There's so many mysteries surviving around eels. We just don't know. We do know is that they show up, the babies show up every spring in this river and rivers all over the Northeast, the Caribbean, not so much the Caribbean, but northern part of South America, over in Europe, the Mediterranean, all the way to Israel and North Africa. These baby eels called glass eels, they show up in the Hudson River every spring by the millions. Even that is very cyclic. Some years we can't find them. Some years they're just everywhere. They're a fish that's very mysterious, but they're typical of fish that have been around a long time, like the sturgeon. The sturgeon and the eel both have been around for 250 million years. They have seen every cataclysm that you can imagine occur on this earth. The plate tectonics, the plates moving all over the face of the earth, and volcanoes, and all sorts of things like that. They've survived. Eels and sturgeon have survived. But sturgeon brought with them a lot of bells and whistles, but they've also brought with them this real odd timing on when they spawn. And eels have this odd idea of spawning at sea and then coming inland to spend their lives. There may have been a time way in the far past when the inland areas were just too dangerous and to spawn out at sea made more sense. Once they got inland, they could fend for themselves a little better. We don't know. These are all the questions we don't really know. But these real ancient fish, and I put quotes around the word ancient, because they are, but they're still old, have all these mysteries surrounding them. Now, I mentioned eels are very cyclic. There's some years we'll see a lot of eels, some years we won't see any eels at all. Go back 20 years ago, we were on the verge of making the American eel an endangered species. Kind of backed off that a little bit right now because we're seeing them come back. Scientists have been looking for what we call the smoking gun, something that may have been causing eels to have good years and bad years. When they're out there in the middle of the Sargasso Sea spawning, we think that's where they are, is there something in the water out there that is causing them to not be successful? And a lot of fingers are being pointed at the stuff that we put on our grass, things we put on our lawn, a lot of these things right here, the pesticides. Some of them are my favorites right here. My neighbors put this on their lawn, little puppy dogs, little child here, pesticides applied. I had one neighbor that had a little girl with pigtails and a puppy dog, and with a big "do not" sign across them. That's a chilling symbol, really. But we think that these chemicals, the high phosphate and other kind of chemicals that are in these, are we call endocrine disruptors. The specific gravity, which means their weight in water, is such that when they wash off the land, into the river, into the ocean, and they get out into the ocean, they settle at a depth in the ocean that seems to be right about a mile below sea surface, right about where these eels are trying to spawn. It's speculative. We think that might have something to do with it. It's settling in an area where spawning is taking place, and the females are just not able to do what they're supposed to be doing. We'll see. We don't really know. This is not the first time we've had something like this happen. You remember DDT. It was banned in 1972. The reason when I was a child I never saw a bald eagle around was because of DDT. DDT got ingested in the food chain through fish and so on, worked its way up to eagles, and the eagles could not lay eggs anymore because the eggshells were so thin they would sit on them and they would crush. We survived that one. You may know Rachel Carson, her famous book Silent Spring, which I recommend to anybody. Rachel Carson, this whole idea of bioaccumulation, she coined that term that if you have toxins in the environment and you keep taking out of the environment, you'll accumulate and keep accumulating until it reaches a maximum amount, and then you'll feel the effects of it from pesticides. Rachel Carson, given the highest honor this country can bestow upon a civilian by Jimmy Carter. And the Rachel Carson story is another very interesting, as sort of a sidebar. When she went through this she was a marine biologist who recognized what was going on, and she incurred the wrath of Dow Chemical and all the other chemical companies, not because she was raining on their parade. She went before Congress and she wrote a lot of articles and she did a lot of lectures about the evils of chemical companies who were putting things on the market without properly testing them. But they didn't like what she was saying. But what's even worse was, remember, this is the 1950s when this happened. She was a woman. They couldn't abide by a woman in those days, the 1950s and 60s, actually being assertive. That's what they hated the most, that she was a woman. So kudos to her. Now we may have another situation with what we have going today. So I mentioned climate change before. 2 species in the Hudson River that we think are giving us indications that perhaps global warming may be affecting them. The rainbow smelt and the Atlantic tomcod. Fish can denote the slightest variation in water temperature. An increase in average water temperature so minute that you or I would not be able to feel it or notice it. A fish can notice it, and it takes them out of their comfort zone. And these are fish that when I was very young, they were around. And when my father was around, the rainbow smelt, another cottage industry, people used to catch smelt in the springtime. Not anymore. Tomcod, when I was very young, we could go out in the river and catch tomcod. Not anymore. These are fish that are boreal species. They're species of the north. This was the southern part of their range, the Hudson River. Now it looks like they're not going to be here anymore. They're going to be leaving. Could be. Again, it's a slight indication, a subtle indication that perhaps climate change is at work. September 1609, as far as fish in the river, something happened. Many of us think that the train went off the tracks. The Dutch showed up, and as far as fish in the Hudson Valley was concerned, humans went from being bystanders to being difference makers. There's every indication that when indigenous people were here, that there were not a lot of profound things going on in terms of humans versus the world that they lived in. When the Europeans showed up, they brought with them really what they considered was the ability to do pretty much what they wanted to do. All right, their marching orders were they could subdue the earth and everything that lives there, kind of do what they want, and they pretty much did. They dammed up tributaries. In defense of them, they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't realize when they dammed a trib like the Mechanico here that they were cutting off a spawning reach of fish by 5 or 10 or 15 miles and maybe reducing the productivity of that stream by 85 or 90%. They didn't know that, right? But they did it. This is an artist's conception of what Manhattan might have looked like in 1608 or 1609 on the right and now on the left. So there has been this profound effect. And it's been reflected in some ways with the Hudson River, but it also gives us an idea of the resiliency of Hudson River fish. We have not found any great, other than the population being reduced by our fishing effort, we have not found a whole lot of changes. Some of the changes that happened once Europeans got here, and once we became the United States, was we began to connecting watersheds, the canals connecting the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, for purposes of commerce. The idea was the Midwest part of the United States had a lot to offer. The East had a lot to offer, and traveling goods back and forth made a whole lot of sense. And they didn't really understand what they were doing by connecting watersheds, things like the Erie Canal. What they were doing was they were inviting fish, other species too, but mostly fish, from the Great Lakes to move into the Hudson. Some fish might have gone the other way. We've not seen any indication of that, but a lot of fish have come in this direction. Some of those things have not been good. Zebra mussels came here maybe 20 years or so ago. And pretty much at the same time, a fish called a freshwater drum showed up. Freshwater drum have lived harmoniously with our other fish. They're one of those species that, yeah, they're not native, but they've learned to play well with others, so to speak, and they eat a lot of zebra mussels. And they both came at the same time. We think there might be possibly a connection to that. One that has not worked out so well is a fish called the channel catfish on top and the white catfish on the bottom. Through most of my life, this was the catfish I saw on the Hudson River, the white catfish. Known as the white catfish because its chin barbels are white, whereas a channel catfish, they're mottled or more dark. The channel catfish is native to the Midwest. The white catfish is native to the Hudson River. And you might think they're catfish, so what's the big deal? Well, the channel catfish has a much more flexible diet. They can eat a lot of different kinds of food. White catfish have more of a focused diet. So what happens is the channel catfish outcompete the channel or the white catfish for the same areas out here. I have not caught a white catfish in the Hudson, and I've been looking for 7 or 8, maybe 10 years. I have not seen a white catfish. The channel catfish have pretty much taken over. There's just no white catfish no more. Native species. There are probably still some around, but they're becoming outcompeted. This is what happens when an invasive species comes in. And the channel catfish, although they're beautiful, they're a hit with rod and reel people. They taste good. But ecologically, they're displacing a native species. And that's what happens when we do things like connecting watersheds. Goldfish and carp. Here's a couple fish we brought over from Europe. The first carp, now carp are found in every state, including Hawaii now. Every state's got carp. And the very first carp were put in the Hudson River around 1824, 1825, right in Newburgh over here. First ones. And it was believed at the time that these were such wonderful fish that we had to have them here. Carp in Europe were such a big hit, mostly because the rivers of Europe had been so decimated that fish like carp that can live in your bathtub were thriving. And a lot of the people in Europe had grown up fishing, angling for these. So they said, wow, I got to have them over here. So we brought them here. They have been a real issue. Now, they've been here for 100 and almost 200 years now, so they've kind of become naturalized citizens. But the fact of the matter is they're bad news for a lot of fish that live in the river. They're very disruptive. They eat eggs of other fish. Other fish have learned to compensate maybe by producing more offspring. We're not really sure how that's working, but carp have been a problem. And goldfish, not so much. Not so many of them. But they're certainly around too. Eagles love goldfish, by the way. And also great blue herons love goldfish. And here's a great blue heron at Downing Park over in Newburgh one day. Yeah. Largemouth bass, smallmouth bass. A lot of people think these are native fish. These were not native fish. The middle part of the 19th century, these were brought from the Great Lakes for sport fishing purposes. So they're not native here. They certainly are around here now. The walleye, one of the best game fish in New York State, well known in the Mohawk. Probably the top place in the world to catch walleye, or is a type of perch. Catch walleye in the world is in the Mohawk River. They're not native either. And then we get these kind of guys, the northern snakehead, which is a species that has found its way into the Hudson Valley. There were a bunch of them over in Orange County. We think we got them all. We think we poisoned a few ponds and got rid of them. But these are an example of how an invasive species can really be invasive. If they're in a body of water and they eat all the fish, they'll simply get up and walk on their fins to another pond. They can stay out of the water and assimilate oxygen from the air for a certain period of time. They can do that. They have a lot of adaptations normal fish don't. And they'll eat your cat or your dog. I mean, they're voracious eaters. And there's some in Long Island. We think we've got most of them now. But this is a fish that's native to Asia that somebody thought was a wonderful thing to have in their aquarium at home until it got to be 4 feet long, and then they couldn't fit it no more. So they take it and they dump it in the stream. And we have indications that somebody from Virginia thought it'd be so neat we ought to have some in Orange County, so they brought a bunch up here. Not good at all. So Hudson River fish fauna, as I wind down here, 224 species, 171 are native, and is the list complete? We know it's not complete. For one example, anyway, there's a fish that lives in New York Harbor called the gray triggerfish. I've seen photographs in newspapers, kind of at a distance. There's a gray triggerfish. I've had people tell me they caught him and put him back. We've never had a fish in hand, or a really good photograph, or any really, really good evidence. So I know there's at least number 225 out there, this gray triggerfish. Again, another fish that shouldn't even be here. They're really a reef dweller that we find in Florida. So we're looking for other fish. We're looking for additions to our list. Just last year, we discovered there was an alligator gar in the Hackensack River, which is a tributary of the Hudson. So we are getting fish here and there that show up unexpectedly. This fish, we're not sure how it got in the Hackensack. This is a fish. If you want to catch alligator gar, you go to Texas and go to the big reservoirs they have, or Louisiana bayous to catch these fish. They're not native to here at all. So it's amazing how they get here. So the question is, what else is out there that we don't know about? Yeah, and that's what keeps me going. That's what when I take students to the river and I pull a net, I always have this anticipation that something's going to come up in that net that will make us all get shivers. You know, wow, look at this. We've never seen this before. And so we're holding out for that. So if you think you come across a species that's not on our list, some other than having a body, I've had people mail me fish in the mail. You know when you send a parcel, they have you put the little button, is it perishable, or somebody has sent fish to me and pressed the button, no, it's not perishable on their parcel. I get a couple a year. I get fish in the mail. And luckily the mail service is pretty quick, so they're usually not all that bad. But let me know. So why do we search? It's this idea, again, being open to sea. The possibilities are endless. I've taken students across the river a couple of years ago. I had a bunch of fourth graders were running down in the water, and somebody said, oh, look, there's a basketball somebody left out in the water. And as we got closer, the basketball had whiskers. It was the head of a harbor seal, So it's that kind of thing that happens that gets us enthusiastic about the river. No moment will ever be repeated. It's a dynamic environment, and you should always expect to be surprised. The 14th, every year we have a day when we sample the Hudson River from the Adirondacks to the sea. The 14th annual day in the life is going to be October 20th this year. My colleague Chris Bowser is the one who's in charge of this, one of many. And so if anyone felt like they want to be a part of this, go and observe, actually help us pull nets, mind the kids, be crowd control. Sometimes we get enormous numbers of students. Anyway, the 14th annual. And we come and search for this. We encourage you to come and help us. That's my grandson on the beach down here who helps me sing. So thank you very much. I have time for questions if we have time. Okay, Anthony. Yeah. Any questions? Yes.
How do those fish, the oyster, do they crush their
Yeah.
shell and they have strength enough?
They do. Yeah, like the drum or the blackfish or the cunner. They've got like molars, and they actually crush them. Yeah, they actually do. Yeah. That's the best way to. It's the best example. The description you gave, they have molars. They actually crush them. Yeah. Fish that are piscivores that feed on fish normally have teeth, sharp teeth. Have a pike, for example. Yes.
I took a seminar from you 30 years ago about shore fishing in Hudson, and I've been pretty much a diehard fisher.
Good. Okay.
I fish right here.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Boat. I've noticed over the last 25 years that the incoming migration always is on the shore.
Mm-hmm.
On the side. The outgoing migration of strikers always seem to be on the other side of the river.
Or out in the middle, maybe.
Well, it seems like Newburgh side or Beacon side.
Well,
you go out there like mid-April on the other shore, you won't see a fish.
Well, fish that are moving in the river play the tides. And inshore, the current will always be less than out in the water, out in the middle. If they're looking to make time, if they're looking to get somewhere quick, they'll be out in the middle of the river because they can get the stronger current. Along shore, they'll often have better opportunities to get food, too. Better opportunities to find fish to feed on. So there's a lot of nuances that go in with
I
that.
know it was like the fresh water and fall water.
It could be. It could be, but when you're catching striped bass out here in the springtime, the water is almost always pretty fresh.
Yeah.
There's usually not that sheer effect.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I got to tell you that the pier that Scenic Hudson's put out here has been such a godsend for blue crabbers and for fishers. It's wonderful. I mean, it's a place where you can go and set up your bait and your rod, and it's not like off of a rock where you're going to lose your key or something. It's really nice, huh?
I feel bad for the boat club.
Yeah, but this is such a nice setup here, just such a nice setup. Yeah. Any questions? No? Okay, well thank you.
I can get you a white cap.
Yeah? Okay. Thank you very much. Grab a checklist of fishes if you'd like back there.